Nathan?
Been a while, hasn't it?
Welcome back to Faith on Film, where we raid your church library and search the good stuff. And welcome to the very long overdue conclusion to musical Jesus Lent.
Today we're here to talk about a film that is not a traditional musical, at least not as we in America think of the term. But it does have quite a bit of singing in it, and since we covered Godspell last year, I figured this was a good time to talk about Son of Man.
This movie comes to us from South Africa and is directed by a man named Mark Dornford-May. Though British-born, he moved to South Africa and later married South African actress Pauline Malphane in 2002. Put a pin in that. He officially became a citizen in 2004. He has a background in theater and did a lot of work for the Royal Shakespeare Company.
Son of Man debuted in 2006 at the Sundance Film Festival, which has been a good source of exposure for independent and smaller films for a couple decades. With that background in mind, let's look at our Jesus movie checklist, starting, as always, with exposition. In a move I don't recall seeing done anywhere else, we actually start with Satan tempting Jesus to turn stones into bread out in the wilderness. It's a tad unorthodox, but I kind of like it. I like being just thrown into the thick of things. And it really immediately sets up the conflict between these two, because them vying for the fate of the world is basically what this story is going to be about.
It's not long, however, before we flash back to before Jesus' birth, focusing on the chaotic times that Mary lived in. This movie doesn't take place specifically in South Africa, but rather a fictional African nation called Judea. And we see the turmoil brought on by various regimes through Mary's eyes. Gabriel even appears to her as she's hiding from Herod's militia in a school after she's found the room filled with murdered children, which makes it kind of an interesting choice that his lead in line isn't be not afraid, because this seems like a perfectly acceptable context to be afraid. But that's neither here nor there.
Within mere minutes of screen time, we understand that this is just one of many ordinary people whose lives and livelihoods are constantly at the mercy of whoever happens to be in power at the time. Herod is in charge during the Nativity, but upon his death, Governor Pilate steps in to lead an interim government to establish democracy, which is all an elaborate smokescreen for just continuing to do things basically the same way Herod did them.
Herod and Pilate resort to basically whatever means necessary to keep the established order, which is not a stretch for Herod's character. We call it the Massacre of the Innocents for a reason. And boy, does this movie not hold back here. We don't see it, per se. The children are mercifully covered with bed sheets before they are executed, but we sure hear it. This is a very, very effective use of implied violence. And Pilate is not shown to be much better.
Jesus mentions in one of his speeches not to believe reports of people simply disappearing. While this isn't necessarily in reference to Pilate's own government, because Jesus was at the time talking about problems all over the world, it winds up being exactly what happens to Jesus. Pilate gives his sanction to Caiaphas and Annas to just deal with Jesus however they want, as long as it's not traceable back to him. Kind of cleverly, while he does this, he's pouring himself a glass of water and it overflows, causing him to need to wipe his hands. Alright, that was a good touch. And then, Jesus is abducted in the middle of the night and, well, you can figure out where that goes from there. This is a pretty real dilemma that people in oppressive situations deal with. Why deal with the problem when you can deal with the problem. Pilate is great at showing the callousness and cruel indifference of those in power, particularly toward the poor.
You may have noticed that Caiaphas and Annas are in this movie too. Hey, Annas got to come along for the ride again. Good for you, you viper's brood. Here they are cast as society's elders, and they're here to oversee the successful transition of power. They're here to carve out their own niche and establish themselves in this new system.
They keep tabs on Jesus from pretty early on, using Judas to spy on them with his video camera. At first, they're more concerned with his miraculous goings-on, but Pilate dismisses these as mere children's stories. Once it becomes abundantly clear, however, that his message implicates the entire governmental system, then he's declared as fair game. This is in sharp contrast to the likes of Hero, where simply performing miracles makes you an enemy of the state.
Nathan, we're moving on. It should be noted that this Caiaphas and Annas aren't really depicted as being religious leaders as much. Their motivations are purely political. And this isn't entirely cut out of whole cloth. Most adaptations of the life of Jesus will at the very least allude to this when portraying the high priest. I mean, it would be better for one man to die. You know the line. This movie just isn't really interested in Jesus getting involved in long theological debates. This movie is more interested in the boots on the ground activist elements of Jesus' teachings. And while long theological discussions wouldn't necessarily contradict what this movie is going for, it would be a distraction.
Now let's turn our attention to the disciples. One particular thing of note, they're co-ed. Simon and Philip are changed ever so slightly to Simone and Philippe. It strikes me as perfectly natural that Jesus would have women in his inner circle. I mean, Mary Magdalene is often termed the apostle to the apostles. The only thing that's weird is that they're not using Mary Magdalene to prove this point, as so many movies are wont to do. There is just one tiny nitpick I have about it, and it's just, it draws too much attention to itself as an adaptational change. When all of the disciples are introduced, it does a freeze frame and then their name pops up. Well, for Simone and Philippe, initially, the masculine versions of their names show up. It seems too dependent on knowing the source material. Imagine if in the 1939 Wizard of Oz film, Glenda started to introduce herself as Tatty Poo before correcting herself and saying, "Oh, no, my name's Glenda." And yes, that actually is her name in the books.
The disciples don't get a lot of individual overall screen time fleshing out their personalities. But that's alright. For the purposes of a 3-act movie, you really do want to focus on the big two, Peter and Judas. This Peter follows many of the usual beats. He starts off as a poor fisherman, and he follows Jesus basically immediately. He doesn't have a "who do you say that I am" moment, but we'll come back to that in a little bit. The main thing that's unique about this particular Peter is throughout the movie he is shown painting murals depicting the various miracles and teachings of the life of Jesus. This is a creative touch that I really like. First of all, because it's a great way to depict the passage of time. Secondly, it really is a good microcosm for how fast Jesus' teachings are spreading and how influential they are. Really think about it. These murals are in very public places, and not only is Peter always able to finish his work, we're never shown anybody coming along and painting over them. It's also a really nice nod to the idea that this is someone who is going to be stepping up in the near future and taking real leadership of this movement. Not to mention, it's a nice callback to the idea of Peter finding a creative way to tell the stories of Jesus, not unlike the oral tradition of the real St. Peter.
His denials are condensed down to a single exchange with one other character, that being one of Pilate's soldiers. However, unlike in the text, the soldier is not going off of memory of what Peter looks like. He has Peter's picture right in front of him, and is fully prepared to bring Peter in until he gets distracted by some noise off that away. So, not only did Peter fail, it didn't even work. There is also the oddity that the very next time we see Peter, he's right back to leading the crowds in songs and chants and whatnot, as if the denials never happened. It just feels like we're missing a scene. It doesn't even have to be a long scene, but look, it's small potatoes, but it is potatoes.
And right on schedule, we come to Judas. As we've already mentioned, this Judas is kind of more of a traitor than usual in that he's shown to be spying on Jesus on behalf of the religious elders, basically from the very beginning. It's shown in a flashback that he was once a child soldier, which adds an element of tragedy to this character, kind of going for the idea that he has known violence for so long that he just can't imagine the concept of peace, and therefore he cannot believe in it.
Nestled inside that flashback is our old friend the devil. They don't try to pass him off as a snake or a shadow or a spooky guy who just kind of looks like a Barack Obama for some reason. No, he's a fairly normal-looking guy, distinctive due mainly to his staff, but normal. And this really underlines what, to borrow a phrase, we might call the banality of evil. For a lot of this movie, he's just standing around watching the events. If this was more comedic in tone, you would expect him to pull out a bucket of popcorn and just start munching down on it. It's almost the same problem we had with the Passion of the Christ. Not quite, but almost. More importantly, this devil feels the most like a metaphor that I've ever seen, and I'm not 100% sure I can explain why. Technically speaking, any depiction of Satan can be read non-literally, but something about how this guy is just so intimately bound up with the oppressive governmental system, it seems to scream to me, not a literal figure.
And where there's a devil, there's angels. So let's talk about Gabriel. Hey, we've never gotten to talk about Gabriel on this little channel, have we? Later. One creative aesthetic that I haven't really seen anywhere else outside of maybe Precious Moments figurines and specials is child angels. And it's not really played up all cutesy as much as it's simply child actors saying these lines, which results in possibly the most beautiful nativity scene I think I've ever seen.
In a nice creative touch, just before the Magi arrive, young Jesus is actually seen playing around with Gabriel. Oh, they're friends! Though Mary can't see Gabriel at this time, she smiles to herself because she knows he's there. This is paid off much later by having Gabriel be the one that Jesus is talking to in the Gethsemane analog scene. You know what? I don't mind this change. Even on a theological level, throughout the Bible, especially in the early stuff like Genesis, angels often interact with humans in lieu of God, directly speaking to them, and it's often treated basically the same. So, why the heck not?
Which brings us to Mother Mary. Honestly, this might be one of the best movie Marys that I've ever seen. Right up there with the Gospel according to St. Matthew and Jesus of Nazareth. In St. Matthew, both young Mary and older Mary were strong performances. They were both played by different actresses, and Susanna Pasolini was the stronger of the two. As for Jesus of Nazareth, Olivia Hussey absolutely nailed everything about younger Mary, but her performance kind of petered out as the character got older. This movie manages to keep Mary engaging and interesting in both phases of her life, and she is played by Pauline Malphane. Told you to put a pin in that. Pauline Malphane actually works with her husband quite often, many times as his co-writer, and that is the case here. And you can feel the passion, pun sort of intended, that she has for this project, infusing both Mary and her world with a lot of authenticity and humanity.
You may have noticed we never once referred to her as the Virgin Mary. That's because this movie doesn't depict her as such. Now, I'm not suggesting that we see Mary sleeping around a lot, but more so that the film isn't interested in Mary's sexual history or lack thereof.
What? What is it?
I felt a great disturbance, as if millions of capital F fundamentalists and Roman Catholics suddenly cried out in terror, and were suddenly silenced.
There's a really touching scene after Jesus has become an adult. He tells Mary that it is time for him to set off and go out into the world and do his ministry. And while normally Jesus would say these lines and he would leave and that would be it, the camera lingers on Mary for a while, letting us really get a sense of she is really sad to see him go, but she is so proud of him at the same time. It's really subtle, beautiful acting. But where this Mary really shines is after Jesus' death. Once she learns that her son has disappeared, she rallies the other women to basically demand answers from Governor Pilate. She leads the crowds in these protest songs, and one of the men who helped dispose of Jesus actually comes to help her exhume his body.
Once they do this, we actually get our Pieta shot with Mary holding the body in the back of the pickup truck. Then she is actually the one to tie up the body in a crucifixion pose to expose the tyrant's crimes. This stirs up the people, leading to a large gathering of them all singing a song led by Mary about how the land is covered in darkness. This then invites a crackdown by the military, who fire off a couple warning shots. Everybody ducks down real quick, and then Mary stands up, looks up at her son's corpse, and resumes singing, now aiming her frustrations directly at the troops in front of her. It's not long before the entire group starts joining in with her again, staring down their oppressors directly, knowing that they could be shot at any moment, and that kind of solidarity is awe-inspiring.
Then there's the Son of Man of the hour, Jesus. There is a phrase that keeps coming up in this movie. This is my world. This first comes up in that opening scene between him and the devil, where he basically says, this is not your world, this is my world. Then, after the massacre of the innocents, Gabriel offers child Jesus a chance to leave this pain and suffering. And Jesus says, this is my world. He is choosing to stay here with us in this world of pain and violence. He is choosing to be the Son of Man.
His miracles are depicted creatively, though not a lot of time is spent on them. A lot more focus is put on Jesus as a public speaker. Not a whole lot of his quotes come directly from the Gospels. I'd give a rough approximation of 40%, but he very much encapsulates the kinds of things that Jesus would say in a modern setting. He tells the elders that they're corrupt and only looking out for their own self-gratification. He condemns pharmaceutical companies for price gouging on medication that people need to live. He tells the people of Judea they are much better and worth more than the government is treating them. Even babysits some children so that their mothers can go protest the government killing their children. Basically, you can see why they would want to kill this guy. His vision of society is not only in direct opposition to theirs, it becomes a viable threat the more he reaches out to people. Because, hey, turns out the thing that governments fear the most is their people deciding that they're irrelevant. Jesus never once fires a shot, but he sows the seeds of justice by completely delegitimizing the existing order.
Going off of what we've said so far, you might get the impression that in this movie, Jesus is a mere man and just a good teacher. After all, the virgin birth isn't really mentioned, and Peter doesn't have a who do you say that I am moment. But honestly, no. This Jesus is unmistakably divine in the context of this movie. His miracles are there, and his teachings are there. The devil is here, the angels are here, and yes, the resurrection is here as well.
So, Steph, did the modern day Jesus thing finally work?
Against all odds, yes. First of all, I love the aesthetic of this movie. This is not a glossy Hollywood production. It feels very authentic and down to earth, which I just love. And secondly, I love that Jesus in the modern day, for once, took place in a country that actually has a history of being occupied by foreign powers. South Africa has a very complicated political history, which I will not pretend to be an expert on. But I do know that Dornford-May drew influence for how he wrote Jesus, particularly how he wrote the death of Jesus, off of real-life anti-apartheid activist Steve Biko. So there is very much a strong anti-imperialist sentiment at work here.
It's also worth noting that this is the only modernization I've seen that bothers to remember that Jesus was poor. The mindset of this movie most reminds me of liberation theology. Spearheaded by Gustavo Gutierrez, the liberation theologians looked around at the poor of South America and asked themselves, how do we tell the poor that God loves them? This idea has gone on to take on a number of iterations, including Black theology, womanist theology, queer theology, and yes, even African theology. And all of them focus on the Bible from the perspective of the marginalized and the oppressed. Because it turns out a lot of the Bible was written by the marginalized and the oppressed. Jesus was born to a poor family in a backwater region of a gigantic empire that didn't give a crap about him. And then when it did give a crap about him, they executed him as an enemy of the state.
On that note, the government being evil in this movie doesn't feel forced. This isn't an alternate reality or whatever the Judas Project was going for. This is a depiction of a version of the world that, for many people, does exist. I don't mean to sound like a broken record here, but the idea of Jesus' story happening in modern day works better in other parts of the world. The United States of America has next to nothing in common with first century Israel. We are a global superpower, have been for some time. If anything, we're closer to Rome in this analogy. It's also important to remember that the story of Jesus is a global story, not exclusively a Western one. This is something that movies like The Gospel According to St. Matthew reminded us of with their music choices.
Son of Man also has incredible music. Even without reading a single subtitle or knowing a word of Kosa, which I don't, I would have been captivated by this music. I am told that the reason there is so much singing is because song, particularly sung music, is very important in South African culture, and I would 100% believe that. It's all diegetic, but I was never once taken out of it wondering how all these people know these words. It just fits so naturally. I was particularly taken with Mary's rendition of the Magnificat.
Speaking of which, have you noticed that this movie was actually a better adaptation of the Gospel of Luke than the Jesus film was? And not so much in terms of events, as we still see scenes that are exclusive to Matthew and John's Gospels, but in its overall theme. Luke is a profoundly political text, from the Magnificat declaring that God favors the humble while removing rulers from their thrones, Jesus saying that the kingdom of God belongs to the poor, his inclusion of women, of other nationalities, and so on. And in just about every instance where the Jesus film failed to capture that, Son of Man does it with flying colors. Even that ending scene where they all stand up to the military can be read as a loose retelling of Pentecost, where Peter denounces the chief priests for their part in Jesus' execution. And guess who was with them at Pentecost? Mother Mary.
Not everything works about this movie all the time. Although, what criticisms I have are far and away not big deals. For instance, it's a little short. Like, every time I watch it, by the time we get to the Last Supper, I find myself thinking, what? Already? I think it's just that this story fits in this setting so well that I want to see more of it. Because it's not like anything feels truncated or rushed past. I just wanted to spend more time here. Which, as far as problems go, it's a good one to have.
There are also a few beats here and there that don't work as well as they should. For example, the scene with the adulteress probably could have used another take. The people who are about to kill her start walking away before Jesus even finishes saying, "Let he who has no sin cast the first stone." Alrighty then. Now here's a question for you. The film ends with Genesis 1:26 appearing on the screen. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, in our likeness." What do you suppose the director meant by that?
Presumably that every person, no matter how seemingly insignificant, is equally worthy of dignity and respect. You get the feeling that Dornford-May really loves South Africa and its people, and that just shows throughout this entire thing. He had a story he wanted to tell, and he did it. And that is why this is a severely underrated money's worth. Son of Man doesn't come up very often in conversations about Jesus movies, and that is a real shame. If you have a chance, you should definitely check it out. Thank you for joining us for Faith on Film. I'm Nathan.
And I'm Stephanie. We'll see you next time.
He completely delegitimizes the established order. Nope. That is not how I should have intoned that.
No, that's not right either.
No, that was right. Just keep going.
Spearheaded by Gustavo Gutierrez No, I'm gonna do that again.
And before long, all the people in the crowd have joined her, staring Herod. Nope, not Herod.
Basically, you can see...
We are a Glober.
Glober. Wasn't that the other cousin on the Andy Griffith Show?
Yes.